had never thought of myself as invisible. But over the years I had become just that, to him, to everyone. The weekend at my friend's house was supposed to be a breath of fresh air. Change of scenery, a distraction. A few days of laughter, light conversations, a little wine. I told myself I needed it. That I deserved it. And then he walked in. I almost didn't recognize him at first. He had been just a boy the last time I saw him. Restless, all sharp edges and untamed energy. But now he had grown into something else entirely. The way he carried himself, the effortless confidence in his step, the way his voice filled the room. It was unsettling. He wasn't the child I remembered. Did you even age? His voice was warm, teasing. His eyes scanning my face with a kind of curiosity I wasn't used to. I laughed lightly, waving a dismissive hand. Flattery will get you nowhere. That's a lie, he smirked. It always gets me somewhere. The way he said it, the way his voice dipped just slightly at the end, made something inside me tighten. It was nothing, just a meaningless exchange. And yet, the way his gaze lingered a fraction of a second too long told me it wasn't just in my head. The night stretched on, filled with familiar conversations and old stories retold for the 100th time. I smiled where I was supposed to, nodded at the right moments, but I wasn't fully there. I could feel his presence across the room, could hear his laughter even when I wasn't listening. It was absurd. At some point the house became too warm, too full of voices, so I slipped outside. The night air was crisp, a quiet relief from the weight of everything inside. I exhaled, feeling the tension I didn't realize I was carrying. And then I heard the door click open behind me. I didn't have to turn to know who it was. He stepped beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating off him. Couldn't take all the noise either, he asked. I shook my head. Just needed a little air. Same, he said. Or maybe I just needed an excuse. His words hung in the air between us, ambiguous, charged. I turned to face him. I shouldn't have. Close, he was even more dangerous. The sharp angles of his face had softened just enough with time, but there was something untamed in his expression, something that felt like a dare. You've changed, I said before I could stop myself. So have you. His voice was softer now, deeper. But not in the way you think. My breath caught. I should have laughed, should have brushed it off, but the way he was looking at me, it wasn't something I could ignore. I took a step back. We should go inside. He didn't move. Probably. But neither of us did. I don't know how long we stood there, caught in something unspoken. But then the sound of voices from inside broke the moment, snapping reality back into place. I turned first, pushing open the door, stepping into the warmth of the house before I could do something foolish. For the rest of the night, I avoided his gaze. But I felt it burning against my skin. I barely slept that night. I told myself it was the unfamiliar bed, the creaking sounds of an old house settling, the remnants of too much wine. But none of those were the real reason. I could still feel the weight of his gaze from earlier, the tension that had stretched between us like a thin, fragile thread, ready to snap. The next morning I did what I always did. I pulled my hair back neatly, dressed in something understated but elegant, a soft blouse, tailored slacks. Neutral. I told myself that last night had meant nothing, that I had imagined it. But when I stepped into the dining room, I knew I was lying to myself. He was already there, leaning back in his chair, coffee cup in hand. He was talking to his mother, relaxed, laughing at something she said. But the second he saw me, something flickered in his eyes. Just for a moment. I took my seat across the table, careful not to look at him directly. But it didn't matter. Every time I reached for my cup, I felt his stare. Every time I laughed at something, I wondered if he was watching my mouth. I tried to ignore it, but my body betrayed me. My pulse was too quick, my breath too shallow. When his leg brushed mine under the table, just barely, just a fraction of a second longer than an accident, I felt heat rush through me. I didn't move away. I should have. The day passed slowly, stretched out with conversations, walks, the usual routine of a weekend among old friends. But beneath it all, something pulsed, quiet but undeniable. By evening, I had convinced myself I was in control again. That whatever this was, I could stop it before it started. And then the dinner party happened. A few guests had come over. Friends of my friend, people I barely knew. The house was filled with laughter and clinking glasses. The air was thick with conversation, warm and buzzing with the easy intimacy of people who had known each other for years. I let myself relax, sipping wine, slipping into the comfortable rhythm of the evening, until I felt him behind me. I didn't have to turn around. I knew it was him. He leaned in slightly, his voice just above a whisper. "Are you avoiding me?" I froze for half a second before taking another sip of wine. "Why would I?" He chuckled softly. "I don't know. But you are." I turned then, just enough to meet his eyes. Mistake. Because I saw something in them that I didn't want to see. Something dark, something knowing. And worse, I felt it in myself too. Someone called my name across the room, giving me the perfect excuse to step away. But the damage had already been done. Later that night, when the guests had thinned out and the house had quieted, I stepped out onto the balcony. The night air was crisp against my skin, cooling the warmth that had settled deep in my bones. And then I heard him. "You really are avoiding me." His voice was closer than I expected. I turned to see him standing just behind me, leaning against the railing, arms crossed. I let out a slow breath. "It's late. You should be inside." He tilted his head slightly, watching me. "So should you." Silence stretched between us, thick and charged. I should have walked away. But I didn't. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was me. But suddenly, I felt his hand brush against mine. His fingers ghosting over my wrist, light as air but enough to make my breath catch. I turned my head just slightly, enough that I could feel his warmth against my cheek. "This is a bad idea," I whispered. "I know." And then his lips were on mine. It was quick, just a breath, just a stolen second. But when we pulled apart, nothing was the same. I stepped back, shaking my head, my pulse hammering. This can't happen. He didn't argue. He didn't push. He just watched me, his expression unreadable. I turned and walked away, back inside, back to reality. But as I closed the door behind me, I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. I woke up with the taste of regret on my lips. Or maybe it wasn't regret at all. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, my heart still heavy from last night. The kiss had been brief, fleeting, but it had changed everything. I told myself it was nothing. A mistake. A moment of weakness. But the way my skin still tingled where his fingers had brushed mine, the way my breath had caught in my throat the second his lips met mine, I couldn't pretend it hadn't. Worse, I couldn't pretend I hadn't wanted it. I sat up, ran a hand through my hair, and exhaled slowly. Today had to be different. I had to be different. By the time I stepped into the kitchen, I was composed. Or at least I convinced myself I was. Breakfast was already in full swing. The smell of coffee and toast filled the air, voices overlapping in easy conversation. I took my seat, careful not to meet his eyes. But I felt him. Across the table, beside his mother, laughing at something she said. His voice was easy, light, unaffected. As if nothing had happened at all. And yet, when his hand reached for the butter knife, his fingers accidentally brushed against mine. It was a nothing moment. An innocent touch. But my breath hitched. Pulled away first. He didn't react, at least not outwardly. But I caught the way his lips twitched at the corner. The smallest hint of a smirk. Damn him. I spent the rest of the morning avoiding him, throwing myself into small talk, helping clear the table, anything to keep myself busy. To work. Almost. But fate had a cruel sense of humor. By the afternoon, my friend suggested a drive out to the countryside. A little fresh air, a change of scenery. It was a casual idea, one that made perfect sense. Until I realized he would be coming too. The drive was long, winding roads stretching through open fields and quiet hills. I sat in the passenger seat beside my friend, while he sat directly behind me. I refused to turn around to acknowledge his presence. But I felt it. Every shift in his seat, every brush of fabric, every sigh. At some point, the conversation in the car faded into background noise, and all I could focus on was him. Then a turn. The car slowed as my friend pulled over near a small scenic overlook. "Let's stretch our legs," she said, already opening the door. I followed suit, stepping out into the crisp afternoon air. The sun hung low, painting the horizon in soft hues of gold. He came up beside me, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched. "You're quiet today," he murmured. I forced a smile. "Just enjoying the view." His gaze slid to me, slow, measured. "So am I." I swallowed hard. We stood like that for a moment, the silence between us thick. I wanted to walk away, to put distance between us. But I didn't. Instead, I turned my head just slightly, meeting his gaze. Big mistake. Because there, in his eyes, was something unmistakable. Something raw. Something dangerous. I opened my mouth, ready to say something. Anything to break the moment. But before I could, my friend called out, breaking the spell. I stepped away first. He let me go. But as we climbed back into the car, as I felt the weight of his stare on the back of my neck, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't running away from him. I was running away from myself. I should have left the moment we got back to the house. I should have packed my things, made an excuse. Any excuse, and left before this went any further. Before I lost what little control I had left. But I didn't. Instead, I moved through the rest of the evening in a haze, trying to convince myself that nothing had changed, that I was the same woman I had always been. Rational, controlled, predictable. But rational women don't let themselves be kissed by men they have no business wanting. Controlled women don't tremble when they feel the heat of someone's gaze across a dinner table. And predictable women don't read too much into the way someone lingers just a second too long when they say goodnight. I had become something else entirely. Later that evening, the house was quiet. My friend had gone to bed early, exhaustion settling into her bones. I had planned to do the same. But as I passed the kitchen, I saw him standing there, leaning against the counter, a glass of water in hand. I hesitated for half a second too long. That was all it took. "You're up late," he said, his voice smooth, knowing. "So are you." His lips curved slightly, as if he could hear the unspoken tension in my voice. For a moment, neither of us moved. I should have kept walking. Should have ignored him. But instead, I stepped into the kitchen, opening the fridge and reaching for a bottle of water, pretending like my hands weren't shaking. I could feel him behind me. Not close enough to touch, but close enough to make my skin prickle with awareness. "Are we ever going to talk about it?" he asked. I tightened my grip around the bottle. "There's nothing to talk about." He chuckled softly, the sound low, almost amused. "Right." I turned then, finally meeting his gaze. Whatever happened between us, it was a mistake. He tilted his head slightly, watching me. "A mistake." "Yes." He took a slow step forward. I didn't move back. "If it was a mistake," he murmured, "why can't you look away?" I swallowed hard. This was dangerous. I knew it. And yet, I stood there, rooted to the spot, my breath coming too fast, my body betraying me in ways I didn't want to acknowledge. He was right. I should have walked away. But I didn't. I stayed. For the longest moment we just stood there, the space between us thin as a thread. And then, his fingers brushed against mine. It was nothing. Barely a touch. But it sent a shiver through me. A ripple of something dark and undeniable. I exhaled sharply, stepping back so fast I nearly knocked into the counter. "This can't happen," I said, my voice hoarse. His expression didn't change. "It already has." I shook my head, forcing myself to look anywhere but at him. "It has to stop." He studied me for a moment and then, softly, almost like a challenge, he said, "Then stop it." The silence stretched between us, heavy, charged. And then, before I could say anything else, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there with my heart hammering in my chest. I should have felt relieved. But all I felt was the slow, aching burn of something I wasn't ready to name. I spent the entire next day avoiding him. I kept my conversations short, my glances careful, my distance deliberate. I convinced myself that if I kept running from whatever this was, it would eventually disappear. But desire doesn't disappear. Wait. It lingers in stolen moments, in the brush of fingers against a wrist, in the way a name sounds when spoken too softly. It hides beneath every breath, every heartbeat, every second stretched too thin. By the time the evening rolled around, the tension had become unbearable. My friend had planned a quiet dinner by the pool, a final relaxed evening before we all went our separate ways. The water reflected the golden glow of the string lights above, the air thick with the scent of summer and something heavier, something unsaid. I had dressed carefully, telling myself it was for no one but myself. A silk blouse light and effortless, a skirt that brushed just above my knees. Simple but intentional. I told myself I wasn't thinking about him. And then I saw him, standing near the edge of the pool, sleeves rolled up, a drink in hand. He looked like he belonged there, like he had always belonged in spaces where women forgot how to breathe. His eyes found mine instantly. A slow, knowing smile curved at the corner of his lips, and in that moment I knew I was losing this battle. Dinner passed in a blur of conversation and laughter that I barely heard. The night stretched on, the warmth of the wine settling deep in my veins. At some point, my friend excused herself, leaving only the two of us lingering by the water. I should have followed her inside. I didn't. Instead, I stayed. The air was thick between us, silent but electric. He moved first, stepping closer, until the space between us was nothing more than a breath. "You're avoiding me again," he murmured. I exhaled slowly. "Because I should." His fingers brushed my wrist, a feather-light touch, but it burned. "And yet you're still here." I didn't answer. Couldn't. My pulse thundered in my ears as he reached out, slowly, deliberately, tracing a line from my wrist to the inside of my palm. I should have pulled away. But instead I let him. My breath caught as he tilted his head, his gaze dropping to my lips for half a second too long. And then, his lips met mine. There was nothing careful about this kiss. It wasn't hesitant like the first, wasn't laced with guilt or uncertainty. It was raw, insistent. It was the unraveling of everything I had tried so hard to hold together. His hands slid to my waist, fingers curling against the fabric of my blouse. I felt the heat of his body press into mine, the edge of the pool cool against the back of my thighs. I should have stopped. I should have pushed him away, told him this was wrong, told him we couldn't. But I didn't. Instead, I kissed him back. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the consequences. Not the reality waiting on the other side of this night. Only this. Only yes. A sound, a sharp shift of movement, made me break away. For a moment I thought we had been seen. I turned my head, heart hammering against my ribs. But the backyard was still empty, the house behind us dark and silent. Still the spell was broken. I stepped back first, my breath unsteady, my body still thrumming with the weight of what had just happened. "This can't happen again," I whispered. His gaze was unreadable, dark with something I couldn't name. "Then stop it," he said, just like before. But this time he didn't walk away. And neither did I. I had crossed a line. I had told myself it wouldn't happen again, but the second time felt even more inevitable than the first. As if I had been fighting against something stronger than myself, something that had been waiting to happen all along. And now I was unraveling. I spent the morning in a daze, moving through my usual motions with careful precision. Making coffee, answering a few emails, straightening up the living room as if that would somehow straighten up the chaos inside me. The doorbell rang. I welcomed the distraction, shaking off the lingering thoughts as I walked to the door. A courier stood outside, a large box balanced precariously in his hands. "This must be for you," he said, shifting his grip slightly. I nodded, reaching out, but before I could take it, the weight shifted. The box slipped. It fell too fast for either of us to stop it, crashing onto my feet with a heavy thud. Pain shot through my toes, sharp and immediate. A strangled gasp tore from my throat, and I stumbled back, instinctively clutching at the doorframe for support. "Oh God, I'm so sorry." The courier dropped to his knees, scrambling to lift the box, but it was heavy, and for a moment he struggled. I clenched my jaw, suppressing another pained sound as the weight finally lifted off my foot. "Are you okay?" he asked, his face etched with concern. I inhaled deeply, forcing myself to steady my breath. "Yes. Just unexpected." He apologized again, but I shook my head, waving a dismissive hand. "It's fine. These things happen." He looked doubtful but nodded before handing me the package more carefully this time. I signed for it, mumbled a quick thanks, and shut the door. Leaning against it for a moment, I exhaled. The pain in my foot was already fading, but something else lingered. I had spent all morning pretending I was fine, as if last night hadn't changed something fundamental inside me. But the truth was I wasn't fine. I was slipping. I had spent so many years believing I was in control of my emotions, my body, my choices. But now I felt like a woman standing on the edge of something vast, something dangerous. I pressed my fingers to my temples, willing myself to focus. I needed space. I needed to breathe. And yet, even as I stood there, I knew the truth. I didn't want distance. I wanted him. And that terrified me more than anything. I should have left. I should have taken this ridiculous box, packed my things, and gone home where it was safe, where life was predictable, where I wasn't standing at the edge of something I couldn't control. But I didn't. Instead, I sat there, staring at the package on the table, my foot still pulsing from the pain, as if it were some kind of punishment for what I had done, or what I was about to do. I heard the front door open. A step. I knew who it was before I even turned around. He stood there, hands in his pockets, his gaze locked onto mine with that quiet intensity that always made my stomach tighten. "You're hurt," he said. "It's nothing." He didn't believe me. Without another word, he crossed the room, his movements slow, deliberate. I should have stood up, should have put space between us. But I didn't. Instead, I let him kneel in front of me, let him reach for my foot with careful hands. "Let me see." I exhaled sharply as his fingers traced gently over my ankle, pushing the fabric of my slacks slightly upward. His touch was warm, sending a slow, deliberate heat curling through my body. "This isn't why you came here," I whispered. He looked up then, his fingers still resting against my skin. "No." The air thickened between us. My breath was too shallow, my pulse hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it. "Then why?" His eyes darkened. "You know why." I did. He leaned in, so close that I could feel his breath against my skin. "I should have stopped this. I should have been stronger. But I wasn't." His lips brushed against my knee first, soft, teasing. A warning. Then higher. My hands curled into fists at my sides, every nerve in my body screaming at me to stop this before it was too late. But it was already too late. I reached for him then, my fingers threading through his hair, pulling him toward me. His mouth found mine in an instant, hungry, desperate. This was no longer a hesitation, no longer a question. This was surrender. His hands slid up my thighs, his body pressing into mine, and for the first time in years I felt alive. I didn't care about the consequences. I didn't care about anything except the way he made me feel. The sound of a door creaking open made us freeze. A step. Voice. We pulled apart just in time. My friend stood in the hallway, looking at us. Too closely, too knowingly. Something flickered in her expression, something I couldn't place. Then she spoke. "You're hiding something." My heart stopped. I forced a breath, willing my voice to be steady. "Don't be ridiculous." She tilted her head, studying me. "Aren't I?" Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. And in that moment I knew. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning.